Yo, over the peak dudes, are you ready for another ball bouncing week? Let's go. United States housing units added to stock. Amount of new houses being built. Let's go for the 1 to 4 units, the smaller type houses, and read backwards from 2011, estimated at 433,000 at the moment. Now, if we read upwards, we've got 500,000, 500,000, 800,000, 1.2 million, 1.7 million, 1.7 million in 2005. Point to make here is 2 points. One, they're making a lot less houses, so that's a lot of construction jobs and general turnover of housing that's not being done. I believe new housing goes into the GDP, selling old houses doesn't. So this is obviously taken a lot out of GDP. But second point is, if you want a recovery in the housing market, you've got to get the supply and demand balance a bit more in balance, and building less houses and perhaps knocking down older ones, demolition and scrappage there at around about 200,000 a year must be done until everything is in balance again. Too many houses, it seems, were built. And just to put a bit of context on this, this is the top of that chart. Housing units added, it's all the same. 1 to 4 units, this is 1990, so we're going back a good while. A million, 900,000, a million, 1,000,002, 1,000,001. So that's the basic, average that was knocking on, and they're at 433,000 estimated for this year, with 500,000 last year. Right. Because I mention that because everyone used to say in the old days, before other things seemed to come and take over, that it's the housing market for the United States that is at the bottom of everything. To get the United States economy moving again, first the housing market must be got going again. And for the moment, no sign of that. Right, the treasuries. Oh dear, it's looking all a bit weird, isn't it? Too weird for words. Anyway, Doug Short, brilliant chart, wonderfully colourful and informative in its way. I'm sure other people will be able to read all sorts into this. I can't so much. Let's start at 2007 when it starts. The target rate, the Fed funds target rate, right up at the top, obviously was whatever it was, about 5. So all of the Treasury bonds were up there, all constrained, constricted, pushed up between 4.5 and 5.5. But as the crisis, the grey bar there, vertical, came in end of 2007, start of 2008, the Fed funds rate was dropped down and down and down, and the different coloured bond strings were allowed to open up. And obviously the shorter term dropped down following the Fed funds target rate, and the longer 30-year bond at the top there was allowed to float high. But at the moment it's frighteningly low. We've got on that, the yellow is the 3-month bill at 2 basis points. The 2-year note is at 20 basis points. The 5-year note is at 0.9, 0.9% for 5 years, under 1% for 5 years. The 10-year is effectively 2%, and the 30-year 3.3% for 30-year bond. That obviously means that if you want to refinance your mortgage, is now the time to do it. I don't know. I can't advise on that, but I would have thought that wonderful mortgage refinancing offers should be out there at least. Doug Short chart again. This Philadelphia Federal Reserve General Activity Index recessions highlighted in grey at the back. This is the chart or the information that so whacked up the sides, the head of the stock market, equity market last week. that huge drop down at the end, that's what done it. And you can see how it's affected, why it's affected the market when it drops down to that sort of level. In the past, I've just highlighted them to make them easier to see. It always concurs, it comes at the same time of one of those grey bars, which is a recession every time. So it really doesn't need anything more to kind of say that, unless this is a huge mistake, the United States is moving into another recession. It could just bound up again, and it won't be, but everything is pointing towards a double dip. Princeton, New Jersey. So this is Gallup. The Gallup poll people President Barack Obama's approval rating on the economy. The poor bastard. 71% disapprove and 26% approve. That the man in the White House, well, no, he's not at the moment, he's on holiday, isn't he? But still, if he was in the White House, he was meant to be doing something about the economy, and they don't think he is. And a note at the bottom, Obama earns similarly low approval for his handling of the federal budget deficit, 24% give him approval, and creating jobs, 29%. He's meant to create jobs. Moving on, Edward Hugh talking about Italy, particularly in this article. Edward Hugh, who I've told you who he is and what he does, and I'll give you the whole of what's written here. According to one anonymous German official speaking off the record to reporters from Der Spiegel, a country like Italy can't be saved. We will have to trust that he was referring to the country's size when he made the statement and not its existential core. If he was, he may well be right, at least under Euro area's current institutional arrangements. So let's have a quick look at why. And I'm going to have a quick look at his quick look. But continuing on, the ECB backstop works for now. The Euro politicians are all off on holiday and they've left the ECB to look after the children, and the ECB doesn't like children. The Italian debt markets are a lot calmer this week than they were the week before last. Evidently there is a simple explanation for the phenomenon, and that is that the level of Italian bond yields is now more or less completely guaranteed by the European Central Bank. Systematically and meticulously, the Italian 10-year bond yield is being maintained at or around 5%. That level by a team of dedicated bond traders in national central banks dotted around the euro area. Did everything work there? I think there was a bit of a power blip. Still there? Still there? Carry on, Nick. The process whereby this result is achieved is not that dissimilar to other more common central bank interventions, for example, to target a certain exchange rate or given overnight interest rates. Basically, when the yield rises above a given threshold, the ECB's representatives simply step in and buy bonds. This happened last week to the tune of some 22 billion euros, with bonds being acquired from a set of 5 EU peripheral countries. Although we don't know how the purchases were broken down at national levels, one thing for sure, there were a hell of a lot of Italian bonds tucked in there somewhere. So that's what they're up to, and I think we can understand that. From this article of Edward Hughes, this I think is the most important chart when it comes to Italy, and it's Italy's GDP. 10-year moving average 1980 to 2010, the last 30 years. So their GDP was coming in at around 4% 30 years ago, but you can see the trend, and it's a 30-year trend, and it's down. They've made absolutely no recovery from the recession, and it's immersione. Dive. And obviously with the austerity, that's going to go down further. And when you haven't got growth, you haven't got the ability to pay your 120% of debt to GDP. So the ECB has to do it for you. Right. Ekaterini, Greek unemployment rate hits all-time high. Unemployment in Greece grew at a stunning rate of 1,200 people per day in May, climbing to 16.6%. And presumably that sort of action will be actioned upon Italy when it does its austerity as well. It's no way to organise a stunning growth recovery so you can pay your debts. But somehow these countries have to be sorted out, apparently, say the Germans. Right, I'm going to finish here with the European Central Bank as lender of last resort by Paul de Grauw. Now, this is kind of an official view of what's going on, but I think it's a very clear picture of what's going on in Europe, and what's going on in Europe, if it continues to go as wrong as it is going wrong, will bite your ass, whoever you are, wherever you are. So you can come along. This is going to be quite long because I'm going to read the top half of this article to give you an idea of what he's talking about. All right, so this is going to be all Euro stuff. Stick along or not, or just go to the link and read it all for yourself. But I'll try and read enough to induce you to go there to read this sort of stuff. So, with the Eurozone crisis casting doubt over the solvency of Spain and Italy, the ECB has once again intervened to provide liquidity in the government bond markets. This column asks the question, is there such a role for the ECB as lender of last resort? Okay, in we go. In October 2008, the ECB discovered that there is more to central banking than price stability. This discovery occurred when it was forced to massively increase liquidity to save the banking system. The ECB did not hesitate to serve as lender of last resort to the banking system, despite fears of moral hazard, inflation, and the fiscal implications of its lending. Hang on. So, the ECB came in behind the banks in 2008. Things were very different when the sovereign debt crisis erupted in 2010. This time the ECB was gripped by hesitation. A stop-and-go policy ensued, in which it provided liquidity in the government bond markets at some moments and withdrew it at others. When the crisis hit Spain and Italy in July 2011, the ECB was compelled again to provide liquidity in the government bond markets. This behaviour raises the question, is there a role for the ECB as lender of last resort in the government bond markets? Fragility of a monetary union. It is useful to start by describing the weakness of government bond markets in a monetary union. Bullet point. Eurozone governments issue debt in a foreign currency, i.e. one which they do not control by fiat. Bullet point. Thus, governments cannot guarantee to the bondholders that they will always have the necessary liquidity to pay off the bond at maturity. This contrasts with standalone countries that issue sovereign bonds in their own currencies. This feature allows these countries to guarantee that the cash will always be available to pay out the bondholders. This is why a standalone country can provide an implicit guarantee. The central bank is lender of last the lender of last resort in the government bond market. United Kingdom, United States, the Bank of England, the Fed can always come and make the money available to pay off the bondholders. The absence of such a guarantee makes the sovereign bond markets in a monetary union prone to liquidity crises and contagion, very much like banking systems, where before central banks backstop them as lenders of last resort. How the existence of a lender of last resorts prevents bank runs. In a banking system, without such backstopping, one bank's solvency problems can quickly lead deposit holders of other banks to withdraw their deposits. In other words, a bank run. This sets in motion a liquidity crisis for the banking system as a whole. The next step comes as banks try to sell off their assets, thus pushing down their prices. The asset price collapse can go on until the point when the banks owe more than they own. This is how the liquidity crisis triggered by a bank run can degenerate into a solvency crisis, thus justifying the fears that led depositors to run in the first place. It was exactly this sort of instability that was solved by requiring the central bank to play the role of a lender of last resort. The point is that when people know that they will, in any event, get their money back, they do not panic and withdraw their funds. The really neat thing about this solution is that it rarely has to be used. The very existence of a lender of last resort prevents the cascading loss of confidence. The government bond market in a monetary union has the same structure as the banking system, or a banking system, not the banking system. Yeah. Buyer of last resort for government bonds. When solvency problems arise in one country, say Greece, bondholders may sell other nations' bonds as they fear the worst. This loss of confidence can trigger a liquidity crisis in these other markets because there is no buyer of last resort. Without such a backstop, fears can grow until the liquidity problem degenerates into a solvency problem. In the case of bonds, the cycle starts as the loss of confidence increases the interest rates governments must pay to roll over bonds. But the higher interest harms governments' solvency, since there is always an interest rate high enough to make any country insolvent. The cycle of fear and rising interest rates may lead to a self-fulfilling default, just like the banks. The single most important argument for appointing the ECB as lender of last resort in the government bond markets is to prevent countries from being pushed into this sort of bad equilibrium, a self-fulfilling debt crisis. In a way, it can be said that the self-fulfilling nature of expectations creates a coordination failure, i.e., the fear of insufficient liquidity pushes countries into a situation which there will be insufficient liquidity for both the government and the banking sector. The central bank can solve this coordination failure by providing lender of last resort facilities. Now we're going to link the two together. Backstopping banks without backstopping government debts may be expensive. I'll give you that again. Backstopping banks without backstopping government debts may be expensive. Failure to play the lender of last resort role for government bonds carries the risk of forcing the ECB to actualise their lender of last resort promise to banks. I'll give you that again as well. Failure to play the lender of last resort role for government bonds carries the risk of forcing the ECB to actualise their lender of last resort promise to banks in the countries hit by the sovereign debt crisis. And this sort of lending is almost certainly more expensive than backstopping the government debt. The reason is that typically the liabilities of the banking sector of a country are many times larger than the liabilities of the national government. This is shown in figure 1, which you can see. We observe that the bank liabilities in the Eurozone represent about 250% of GDP, and this compares to a debt to GDP ratio of the Eurozone governments of approximately 80% of GDP. And you can see Ireland's extreme at 600, Belgium, Netherlands and the UK are still horribly out there at 400%. These are the bank liabilities compared to their country's GDP. And even down there at Austria is still 120% of GDP for the banks, as opposed to a much more reasonable amount for the country, Austria. What he's saying is if you don't back the countries, the banks become wobbly because the countries aren't being backed, and then you have to buy back the banks, which in the end is more expensive. So it might be you've got to back the whole bloody lot. Anyway, that article goes on in that, I think, very clear explanatory way for a good few more paragraphs, and comes to a conclusion in the end that you might want to follow the link and read or not. But this is the sort of thing that they have to get right. If they don't, we get our asses bit. Have a good week. Bye.